Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tomiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program titled The Stories We Tell and the Objects We Keep, Asian American Women and the Archives. I'm thrilled that we're finally able to gather for this important program, albeit virtually, and I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to everyone who made this event possible, especially the members of the Planning Committee and to all our distinguished speakers. I'm also grateful to Professor Jane Kamensky, the Pforzheimer Foundation Director of Radcliffe Schlesinger Library, Ken V. Phillips, Curator for Race and Ethnicity at the Schlesinger, Rebecca Wasserman, Executive Director of Academic Ventures and Engagement, Jessica Vicklin, Director of Events, and to their outstanding teams. Thank you. Finally, I want to thank members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors whose support keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public. This afternoon, we set out to explore issues that go to the heart of the Radcliffe Institute's mission and to the legacy of Radcliffe College, founded to make Harvard accessible to students and scholars who were then excluded from this university. We're dedicated to excellence, opportunity, and inclusion, and today's conference advances this commitment by exploring ways to reimagine and preserve the stories of Asian American women. Discourse on race in the United States is frequently predicated on a Black-white racial binary that can conceal the breadth and depth of the American experience of race. That's why opportunities like this one for a more inclusive discussion are so important. We also have a second objective in mind today. The project of telling a more complete history is integral to the work of the Radcliffe Institute. Radcliffe Schlesinger Library is the preeminent archive on the history of women in America. But the materials housed in the Schlesinger do not yet support the telling of the history of American women in its richness. To begin to remedy this, in recent years, we've committed to diversifying our collections. The Asian American Women's Advisory Group that seeded the idea for today's conference is a key part of that effort. Working together, we seek to ensure that the archives reflect the full variety and the depth of American women's lived experiences, including not only the experiences of women in positions of power, but also those of women who didn't or don't consider themselves history makers and who may not realize the importance of preserving their stories. Far too often, the history of we the people has been narrowly focused on a privileged and powerful few. By foregrounding women and gender, and by documenting diverse experiences across race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and political ideology, we can tell a far richer and more accurate history of the United States. And this is vital to the broader work of securing equity and opportunity for all. Over the course of our program today, we'll be joined by distinguished Asian American scholars, activists, and creative artists. These speakers will share with us stories of their own families' lives in the United States, stories of other families and communities, and the objects behind those stories. Through these examples, we will see firsthand the power of archival materials, objects, written records, photographs, and more to complicate historical narratives. It's an opportunity to celebrate the strides we've made, but also to recognize the important work that remains to be done. Thank you again for being here. And now I'd like to turn things over to Genevieve Clotario, the Andrew W. Mellon Assistant Professor of American Studies at Wellesley College. Welcome, Genevieve. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the Harvard Radcliffe Institute for this opportunity to share and tell the stories and histories of Asian American women. And I want to start with an object from my own family collections, a photograph, hopefully we can get that up, a photograph my mother shared with me a few years ago. In the image are three people I'll describe the photograph for you. Hopefully we can get the photograph up. So in this image, there are three people at a hospital in Los Angeles, California, decades ago. The woman on the left is Dr. Sakae Shigegawa. The woman on the right is my mother, Feli. And the wailing, angry, red-faced newborn infant is, can you guess, me. So I'm going to use this found object as a guide to help ground us in the rich, ever-changing, and growing field of Asian American women's history. While it's impossible to truly give a complete overview of the far-ranging, complex, and deep histories of Asian American women, what I can do today is give us a sense of the scope, the contours, and the shifts in Asian American women's history and scholarship. So the term Asian American is a constructed pan-ethnic term that emerged out of the political and social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. And Asian American was coined to forge political links between heterogeneous individuals and communities in order to create solidarities against institutional racism. Asian American studies as a field of research also stemmed from these movements, and scholars began studying and writing on Asian American women as an answer to the call for more scholarship and histories. They were driven by political necessity. They were driven by the need to document marginalized and unrecognized histories. Earlier works in Asian American women's history made critical interventions in the writing of US history. Written not as additive or derivative stories, these works were central to the experience of Asian American women. They centralized their experiences to give us the much needed vantage of what Erica Lee calls the gendered roots and routes of US history. So what emerged were histories of how the first federal immigration restriction policy, the PAGE Act, targeted Chinese women specifically, and other examples such as, and as the field grew, so did the work on the contradictions of citizenship and belonging, as well as discourses of freedom and rights, as is the case of Japanese incarceration during World War II. Here's where I turn to the photograph again. So I stumbled upon my doctor, my mother's OBGYN, and also our family doctor, Dr. Shigegawa's story in Valerie Matsumoto's book, City Girls, a book that I was excited to teach in the first Asian American Studies class that I taught, actually here at Harvard. So it was jarring and moving to learn about the woman who was our family doctor, a woman who my mom always encouraged me to look at as a role model. And I learned through this book that Dr. Shigegawa was born in 1913 to a Japanese gardener and a picture bride in South Pasadena, California. And it was during the outbreak of World War II that Dr. Shigegawa was a medical resident at the Los Angeles County Hospital. However, with the signing of Executive Order 9066, she, like so many other Japanese Americans, was dismissed from her position. Dr. Shigegawa and her family were then incarcerated at the Santa Anita racetrack that had been transformed temporarily into a sorting center. There, she treated patients and was able to avoid incarceration at the Heart Mountain Camp by accepting an opportunity to continue her residency in Chicago. It was in 1948 that Dr. Shigegawa finally returned to Los Angeles and sought to establish a new private medical practice. And there, Shigegawa faced racist housing covenant laws, which her neighbors used to try to oust her and her family. Over the course of time, the racial and ethnic demographics of Los Angeles changed, and the majority of her patients were immigrants and people of color, many of whom were turned away from other practices and hospitals, a symptom of inequality, systemic racism, and anti-immigrant ideologies. By the year 2000, Dr. Shigegawa estimated that she had delivered between 20,000 and 30,000 babies, and I was, as you can see, one of those babies. So the photo shows two women whose Asian American stories are quite different. My mother came to the United States in 1980. She left the Philippines in the midst of a brutal dictatorship that was under martial law. She was able to enter the United States on a work visa that was a product of an ongoing colonial relationship between the Philippines and the United States, which influenced the making of the Philippines into what Robin Rodriguez calls the labor broker state. My mother describes Dr. Shigegawa as she was recounting to me the story behind this photo. She described to me Dr. Shigegawa as a mentor and a friend who soothed her loneliness and longing for family and assuaged her fears around childbirth and parenthood. And we can end the photo share here. Thank you. I highlight my mother's story and her appearance in this photograph to also mark a shift in the field of Asian American women's history. From its inception, Filipinx American studies hadn't necessarily grappled with histories of empire and its influence in the global circuits by which Filipinos navigate. But it was in the early 2000s that we began to see the larger field of Asian American studies take a transnational framework more seriously. In this turn, the transnational identifies movements of people, ideas, things, and capital across and between borders. And as a result, new topics and histories have emerged. But at the same time, the topics that have long been at the heart of Asian American studies started being analyzed in new and exciting ways. So for example, the immigration narratives like that of my mother began to take into account not only the policies that allowed her to enter the United States, but also the global forces that would have influenced her movement in the first place. In turn, it is Asian American women's lives that gives us new understandings of larger historical forces. Asian American women's history uncovered overlooked vantage points concerning immigration, policies on housing and land, community formation. Their stories show us the impact of colonialism and empire on constructing labor pipelines that targeted women. These structural forces would shape all forms of labor, from the care work to healthcare and to medicine. And these histories, I suspect, will help us to further comprehend the toll of the current global pandemic of COVID-19. We have seen the numbers that convey the disproportionate and terrifying numbers of Filipina nurses who have died of COVID, for example. The transnational framework in Asian American women's histories also provide insight into the many layers of activist work that didn't just happen in terms of public-facing labor. Lily Kim tells us of the work of Korean American anti-colonial activist women who fundraised by cooking, baking, and selling goods, who went door to door to gain support. Such labor may appear unglamorous, but was continuous to be necessary work that serves as the backbone of communities. Asian American woman also reveals the long-reaching impact of wars and militarization. They force us to reckon with the consequences of gendered and sexual violence in World War II and the Cold War, and call for us to see women as witnesses whose testimonies give us knowledge and truth. They tell us about military brides and transnational adoptions that arose as consequences of militarization. Southeast Asian American women's stories and memories gives us a better understanding of refugee experiences and asylum seeking, and how the realities of war and refugee experiences continue to shape the livelihood and lives of Southeast Asian Americans for many generations. The works on Asian American women and critical refugee studies teach us how to grapple with the notions of displacement and the persistence of war memories. The field of Asian American women's history is rich, and it continues to change and grow. And the work of the symposium stresses the importance of preserving histories, telling stories, and gestures towards new directions and possibilities. I see this symposium and my own work as answering the call of the late Dr. Dawn Mabalin. She told us, "It's our story, and it demands our love and attention and respect, and we need to tell this story." The stories we tell and the objects we find are evidence of life and living. And today we answer the call to continue to uncover, preserve, and tell the stories of Asian American women. It is now my pleasure to introduce a video by Julie Chung, a 2020 Harvard graduate, who will offer a student perspective on our themes. In this unpublished work called Peace Builders, Julie asks how Asian American women are often expected to keep the peace, have built their own meanings of peace in the US and across the Pacific Ocean. Her meditations on the Pacific waters connect her family home in South Bay, Los Angeles, to South Korea, where she is today. Once Julie has concluded, we will move directly into our first panel, Reimagining Our Stories, which will be moderated by Jiyeon Kim, Professor of English at Harvard University. Julie, the virtual floor is yours.
My name is Julie Sunyoung Chung, and today I'll be reading aloud a piece I wrote called Peace Builders. San Pedro, California, 1943. Yuri Kochiyama and her family are sent to an internment camp in Jerome, Arkansas for 2 years under President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. San Pedro, California, 2020. I visit White Point Nature Preserve. There is a plaque at the trail entrance that commemorates the area's large Japanese population who were forcibly removed during World War II. Hikers tug along their dogs' leashes to get to the trail's ocean views. I'm the only one who stops to read. Seoul, South Korea, and San Pedro, California, 1976. US-backed dictator Park Chung-hee donates the Korean Friendship Bell to the people of Los Angeles to celebrate the bicentennial of the US, honor veterans of the Korean War, and to consolidate traditional friendship between the two countries. On one face of the bell, a goddess of liberty holds a torch beside a Korean spirit, appearing as a woman in a hanbok who holds a dove of peace. San Pedro, California, 2020. I visit the Korean Friendship Bell, now a popular spot for Instagram photo shoots and family gatherings. Wine bottles weigh down visitors' picnic blankets from parachuting into the sea breeze. Tourists watch the sunset bleed into the Pacific. I try to imagine the path carved by US Army ships sailing to war. 15 minutes away from San Pedro, California, 2020. I am home with my family, grappling with my role as a peacekeeper, a mediator, a good daughter, and a child of immigrants. The Korean American women I knew as a child faced two choices. Do you keep or do you disrupt the peace? In the face of injustice, they heard advice like, she shouldn't have said that. He can't help it, he's a man. You make it worse by reacting. Just leave things alone, will you please? And so they subdued, they swallowed, and they suppressed. I was socialized to believe that I am a peacekeeper, and peacekeepers do not make a scene. They mediate but never escalate, resolve but never react. They exist to subdue, to swallow, and to suppress. I'm sorry to disturb you, I used to say before anything unpleasant, as if I am the reason why you may feel guilty or unsettled. But that is an illusion of peace, an appearance of still water that has been forced to deep freeze. That is a mirage of calm in the vast ocean space, asking us to contain our movements, our power, our waves. That is a delusion of peace that asks us to silence, conceal, and stifle, so that you may carry on without carrying the damage you cause us. You freeze the ocean's waves, so you're safe on the shore above us. So I'm not sorry to disturb your peaceful hike when I tell you that the US uprooted thousands of Japanese Americans during World War II and sent them to concentration camps on the suspicion of US disloyalty. So I am not sorry to disturb your peaceful picnic when I tell you that the US backed brutal right-wing military dictators in Korea and has over 180 military bases across the Pacific today. So I am not sorry to disturb your fragile illusion of peace when I finally give you a piece of my mind. I no longer want to please or appease just to maybe get a piece of your pie. You say I am disturbing the peace, but I can't disturb what was never alive. There is no peace when we must subdue, swallow, and suppress. There is no peace when there is no justice. No justice, no peace. Together we shout out loud at Black Lives Matter rallies and with protesting crowds. Asian American women are not just here to please. We are here to fight for justice and to build towards peace. We are peace builders and troublemakers. We are here to be seen. I am not sorry to disturb your peace because you have disturbed our own for too long. So when Yuri Kochiyama built transnational movements for freedom and women crossed the Korean DMZ to demand US imperialism's retreat, they built a peace by undoing the ocean's deep freeze. I dream of a peace where the waves dance freely and our feet feel the movement of the water, splashing, crashing, and soaring in the sea breeze.
Thank you so much for that powerful presentation, Julie. Hello, everyone. My name is Chiyun Kim, and I'll be moderating the first panel, Reimagining Our Stories. I'll be introducing our three speakers and then offering just a few thoughts about the kinds of questions and ideas that you'll see running through their various presentations. So our first speaker is Taz Ahmed, an activist, storyteller, and poet who is the co-host of the Good Muslim, Bad Muslim podcast. She will be followed by novelist Gina Apostol, the writer of Insurrecto, which was published in 2018, and The Revolution According to Raimundo Mata, which just came out. So congratulations, Gina. And finally, our third speaker is Hong-On Chung, a photographer and sound, video, and performance artist who is also an associate professor of art and art history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Organized around the idea of reimagining our stories, this panel explores questions of how to tell stories that exceed, trouble, and perhaps transform the kinds of stories that have already been told about Asian America, the Asian diaspora, and Asian American women in particular. We're immediately confronted with the question of what counts as our stories when those stories are necessarily mediated by a range of historical, social, and cultural factors, including transnational migration, stereotypes, as well as tropes about race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexuality, class, and established genres and conventions of cultural expression. But that's a lot of academic talk. To put it another way, we always come into our story late, after the set has been built, the audience has been prepped, and the actors have been cast and have already started memorizing their lines. But what if we don't like what we see? You'll hear in these presentations how these three artists have worked through an often violent and dehumanizing archive as a way both to acknowledge its power and to challenge it. And I should note that some of what you'll see will be very disturbing. You'll see how they've experimented with putting different genres and media in conversation with one another as a way to unsettle our relationships to objects, sounds, and images, and thus to get us to experience and understand familiar stories differently. And finally, I hope you'll come away with an appreciation for how each of them asks us to think critically and imaginatively about the limits we might draw around what we believe is our story and our history. And so with that, I'm very happy at this moment to turn the virtual floor over to Taz Ahmed.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm already so emotional watching everyone speak. It's so wonderful to be in this space. We're a year into this pandemic, so this also feels very helpful to talk to people. I'm going to share my screen, so give me 1 second while I figure that out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my trajectory as a Muslim American politico and artist. And in the end, I'll talk about some of the things I've made. I grew up in the 80s, so I grew up with these images of what it means to be brown and Muslim in this country. At the time, I thought this was kind of exciting. I was like, oh, brown representation, but I had no idea that this was brown face and this was exotification and this was, you know, things that weren't good. But at the time, just having representation meant something. gonna move this box down. I don't know if you can see it. This is my family. My family's from Bangladesh. I put this in there because I saw Genevieve's mom's picture and I was like, oh, I'm gonna keep this in my presentation. That's my mom in the middle. My mom is the driving force of a lot of the reasons why I got my start in doing political organizing. The origin story that I talk about often is about September 11th. I was in DC. I had just moved to DC. I was 21 and I got a call on the phone from my mom. And she said that the FBI had come to our house and she had let the FBI into the house and they were interrogating all Muslim people at the time in 2001. And I had told her, now we know, don't let the FBI into your house. And in that conversation, my mom said, it doesn't matter how long I've been in this country, I'll always be a second-class citizen. So that's been kind of that guiding light that's really driven a lot of the work that I've done, both as an activist and as an art maker. I started an organization in 2004. This was the first major presidential election after the 2001 event. And I started an organization organizing South Asian Americans out to vote. One of the things that I did was I took all the voting activism skills that I had learned over the years and just applied it to being South Asian. This was the first time this had ever been done. One of the things I learned doing this process was that, people don't talk to brown people about politics. They don't talk to Asian Americans about politics. I did a lot of organizing with both South Asian and Asian Americans in that election cycle. And this really got me thinking about what does it mean to include our communities in the civic engagement conversation, one that we're often excluded out of. I was also writing on this blog at the time called Sepia Mutiny. It was a South Asian American blog. It was a group blog with a bunch of other brown kids. And our mission, I guess, was just to write something that was happening in society that was South Asian American related. And this process was really fascinating to me because I wasn't seeing our stories being told anywhere else. We were excluded from the mainstream narrative. There wasn't like a site where you could go to learn everything that was happening. And as I moved forward with my education, I learned that what we were actually doing was telling the counter narrative of a community. And that really motivated me and was a grounding force, realizing that all the activism that I was doing, all the storytelling that I was doing was related to this, what critical race theorists were doing, and was related to telling the counter narratives of our community and how important that was. I started doing a lot of digging into our South Asian American history. I'd come from immigrant. My dad immigrated here in 1969. So when he immigrated, there was not this idea that our history went a lot further than that. The middle picture here, this is a cover from the Bellingham race riots that happened in 1907, where South Asians who were working in the paper mill up in Bellingham were driven out of town by white supremacists. And when I started thinking about how here in the now that we're experiencing all these hate crimes against South Asian Americans, especially after the 2016 election cycle, that there was actually 100-year history of this happening that really reframed a lot of my thinking around how we talk about anti-Asian hate crimes. I'm also here in Los Angeles, and I've been doing a lot of work with the local Japanese American community. So on the left, you'll see an image of Manzanar. On the right, you'll see an image that we see often of the Bangladesh liberation movement that was happening in 1971. And I think one of the things that I wanted to bring up in showing this image is how history is connected to each other. That my history of having a mom who had to leave with everything that she could carry in her backpack from when they had to escape from West Pakistan to now Bangladesh was so similar to my friends who have family members who had to escape with everything they could in their bags to go to concentration camps. And I think these kinds of histories are, they're not just transnational, but they're transhistorical, where they're connected over time and space. And we need to make those connections to do solidarity organizing, which is what we've been doing a lot of down here. And then, of course, these are more contemporary images of protests that are happening. And I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is how are we, as we protest now, how are we documenting what's happening now so that we don't forget it? I know one of the things you always hear on Twitter is people say, historians will look back on this, but historians are traditionally not telling the stories of Brown and Black communities, and we need to be the historians of our own communities. So, so how do we make radical art for radical times for our people? So these are some of the projects that I've worked on. I'm highlighting them because we're talking about objects and archives, and I thought it would be interesting to share, and hopefully it can help inspire some people. I've been in a lot of anthologies. The book on the left is called Love, Inshallah, The Secret Love Lives of American Muslim Women. That came out in 2011. And that book was really one of the first anthologies out there about Muslim American women telling their own stories in their own way. And that really shaped my life as a writer in many ways. This project came from the sign in the top right corner, the no moon star, could be a hate crime against the universe, or it could be a hate crime against Muslims. These signs were over the 101 for a couple years. So me and my friends would always go and take down the signs. So I took down the signs and I turned them into art, which is what the bottom image is. I was also involved in this art show, activist art from South Asian California. The image up, the flag image is mine. And in that image, I use voter registration forms to make the paisleys. And this was really great to be a part of this group show with other South Asians, really trying to figure out how do we tell the stories of our community, not just stories, how do we tell the histories of our community and activist history through art? This was a fun project. There was also a sad project. There was the guy who got kicked off of a plane for saying the word inshallah. So inshallah means God willing. So I did a group poetry project where 17 poets contributed verses on a Google Doc. And we turned it into a poem. We printed it up, and then we snuck it onto airplane magazines. And that was our form of rebellion. I've also been a part of zines. This is the Totally Radical Muslim Zine project that came out of a collective in the Bay Area. This is the biggest project I've been a part of. It was an independent podcast, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. We were around for 5 years. Picture on the right, we recorded at the White House, which is really exciting. And we were one of the few, we recorded the Obama White House, to clarify. It was one of the, I think only a couple of podcasts were ever able to actually get into the White House. And in this conversation, it was me and my friend Zara Nurbash, and we just talked about being American Muslim women. And we're telling our own stories. And that in itself was a radical political act for many people. And that just kind of shows how marginalized our communities are. And then this is like my most recent project I did with the Center for Cultural Power, where I wrote a poem and then they put it to animation about the fingerprinting and how fingerprinting's origin came actually from Kolkata, when the white colonizer went to Kolkata and couldn't tell brown people apart. So they invented fingerprinting, and now we use fingerprinting when it comes to voting. This is my project from this past summer, Aunties with Deadly Stares. This was inspired by 2 Muslim women that were kicked off of an airplane for staring too hard. And so in this project, I've been using paper ephemera of transportation. So a lot of these image paper and collaged in the background are TSA TSA notes that were gifted to me by TSA in my luggages. So I reclaimed them into my art. And finally, these are Yuri Kochiyama. I know we invoked her earlier into the space. These were protest signs that we made for the Women's March in 2017. And then we got contacted by the Smithsonian National Museum of American History that they wanted our poster to be in their collection, which was so stunning and amazing. And just to know that with all of the work that I've done and all this art that's been out there, to know that something of mine is now in the National Museum of American History is really amazing. And I don't know, it's cool. So that is me. And I will pass it on to writer and author Gina Apostel.
Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. I will be reading from a section of my novel Insurrecto, which is set during the Philippine-American War. And there are some violent images here. I cannot see the images as I'm reading from the book. Magsalin shakes out prints of Samar in 1901. Index card-sized pictures against yellowed boards, pictures of banana groves, dead bodies in gray trenches, white soldiers in battle dress fatigues gazing down as if in regret at a charred battleground. Each of the pictures is doubled. Each card is a set of thick twin prints, the prints pasted side by side on stiff panels. All are roughly postcard size. They are late 19th century stereo cards. You look closely at the twin pictures as if presented with one of those optical illusions that should come with the caption, "Find what's missing," but there is nothing missing to find. The two pictures on each stereo card are identical, only a slight time lapse, undetectable, indicates difference. Difference produces perspective. On the Library of Congress website, www.loc.gov, search, quote, Philippine Insurrection, and you come across them, archived stereo pairs from the years 1899 to 1913, the bleak years of US imperial aggression before the surrender of the last Filipino forces to American occupation. A war called by Americans the Spanish-American War. To Filipinos, it's the War of Independence. She looks at the stereo cards, a history in ellipses, too obscure to know, not to mention the words in quotes and not. Insurgents are in quotes, insurrection is not. Rebel is a problematic term. History is not fully annotated or adequately contemplated in online archives. The puzzling duplication becomes mere trope, a cliche. Photographic captions rebuke losers and winners alike. Soldiers, for instance, refer only to white males. Wounded does not suggest who has done the wounding. Magsalin looks with impatience at the familiar photos among Chiara Brazzi, the filmmaker's papers, falling from the manila envelope. The pictures of the dead Filipino bodies and the burned Filipino towns are remarkably precise, but they are hard to see. The passivity of a photographic record might be relieved only by the viewer the photographs produce. And even then, not all types of viewers are ideal. Photographs of a captured country, shot through the lens of the captor, possess layers of ambiguity too confusing to grasp. There is the eye of the victim, the captured, stilled and muted and hallowed in mud and time. There is the eye of the victim, the captured, who may be bystander, belligerent, blameless, blamed. Though there are subtle shifts in pathetic balance, who is to measure them? There is the eye of the colonized, viewing their captured history in the distance created by time. There is the eye of the captive, the soldier, who has just wounded the captured. There is the eye of the captor, the colonizer, who has captured history's lens. There is the eye of the citizens, bystander, belligerent, blameless, blamed, whose history has colonized the captured in the distance created by time. And there is the eye of the actual photographer, the one who captured the captured and the captors in her camera's lens. What the hell was she thinking? So I don't know what's happened now, but I'm going to show you the stereoscope. I don't know if you can see me, but this is a stereoscope. And it contains, I can't see, so I'm going to move this a little bit. This is a stereo card. And what you do with a stereoscope is you're very close to the card and it becomes like a Viewmaster. It's 3D and you push it until it becomes that 3D picture. It's very intimate. It's a weird thing to have this as your entertainment. This was late Victorian era entertainment. Usually you'd find Eiffel Tower, the Nile, I have a lot of these stereo cards and you can buy them in bunches on eBay. And along with the pictures of Versailles or Golden Gate Bridge, you'll find dead Filipino bodies. I discovered them when I had to do research for this encyclopedia on Philippine history. And I found copies of them at the Library of Congress and in folders called Philippine Insurrection. So the pictures, the photocopies are mislabeled, history. The Librarians of Congress mislabel the folders, calling it Philippine Insurrection. I did tell the librarians, change the names on those folders, but I understand from scholars that remains the name on the folders. Filipinos consider this their war of independence. And I will say this about this history. I ended up buying many of these cards on eBay, and I'll show you a bunch of them that I have, a bunch of these cards. And so these are objects that are part of my history. And if you notice, they are stories of multiple histories: the Philippines, the American, the Filipino American, the Asian American, the Asian. And of course, it's an important piece of world history. And it's important for me to recognize that I didn't know about this history growing up in the Philippines. I came to America as a grad student and stayed with, to bring up a family when I married here. But in the Philippines, you don't study the Philippine-American War. You study the revolution, it turns out, is the war against Spain. And so as a novelist, what I was trying to figure out was, why is this not studied in the Philippines? And obviously it's invisible in America. It's really just a small part of the Spanish-American War that people look at. But so I wrote a novel called Insurrecto about this technology, which moved into the technology of filmmaking, and it moved into how colonialism is so linked to these technologies and a story. And so this novel is a story about this war. These are images of suffering and trauma, but if one looked correctly, if one adjusted one's image as you do with this machine, if you adjusted with truth in mind, the art produced by knowledge of this trauma is liberatory. Our job as storytellers is to find the vision, the story that liberates us, the perspective not of our damage, but of our desire, the desire for sovereignty over our bodies and to speak our sense of self as we saw fit. So that is what I did in my novel. Thank you very much. I'll answer any questions because I think I've run out of time. I wrote about women, all women in that novel. Hong An, please welcome Hong An.
Thank you so much, Gina. Wow, that was powerful. I'm still thinking about this phrase that you just said, difference produces perspective. Thank Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who brought us here together and worked hard to make this event happen. I'm honored to be in conversation with you all. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Durham, North Carolina, and from the stolen indigenous lands of the Shakori, Lumbee, and Eno peoples. So I'm going to share my screen and try to get through this quickly. Okay. You know, I'm going to end that really quick because I forgot to do share sound and optimize for video. Do you all see my screen yet? Okay. I'm so sorry. This was supposed to be super fast. Let's see. There we go. Okay. All right. My work as an artist is based on the idea that political battles are ideological and aesthetic. I have understood this implicitly since I was young when I saw old magazine war images of Vietnamese people being killed and experienced a kind of disembodiment, a shock of recognition, a paradox I could not reconcile. I am to be killed, but I'm also to be saved. My work in photography, video, and sound is invested in tearing apart the seams and totalizing national narratives by first pointing out the violent contradictions that those narratives hold. Secondly, by insisting on a transnational framework that links experiences and subjectivities that are connected by capitalist and imperialist war. And thirdly, by interrogating the media tools and conventions of looking and hearing. My work asks how and by whom does the Vietnamese body, the refugee body, the Asian female body become legible when recording devices, as Gina just beautifully articulated, are historically an instrument of colonial aggression and violence. In cultural narratives, these questions play out through the hypervisibility of certain bodies and the erasure of others, stories that are in the service of maintaining narratives that undergird and reify racial capitalist order, which siphons life from Black and POC people while colonizing indigenous lands and brutalizing workers. And this order is in many ways a battle over the images of bodies and a control of the narratives that those bodies contain. A project I did with my collaborator, Hung Ngo, the opposite of looking is not invisibility, the opposite of yellow is not gold, takes up vernacular images from our family archives and juxtaposes them with congressional documents to point out how the US frames humanitarian causes in racial, cultural, and economic terms, a project cast in stark relief to virulent anti-immigrant policies and anti-refugee sentiment. This juxtaposition forces the viewer to confront these vernacular images of Vietnamese people and contend with their own misrecognition of these bodies. As white supremacist ideologies that have always undergirded our society are violently erupting in everyday life, there is a need to assert these kinds of images, to claim them as part of a diasporic narrative in the face of the cancerous myths of American nativism, but also to simultaneously point out its untenable entanglements. These are photographs of my mother and my collaborator's mother, and those are all the pictures that are in these photographs that are rephotographed. So but to also simultaneously point out its untenable entanglements, that the claim to belonging in the national narrative means being complicit with American imperialism. This work resists that impulse to belong. So I want to show a short 1 minute or less clip of a sound installation. This is what it looks like, and we'll see a video where I just took, so you can hear it live. The speakers are active in the installation. So I'm going to go ahead and pause share and skip over to the video. Do full screen. Hold on one second. Okay, so this piece is a kind of decolonial meditation on the history of French and American violence in Vietnam, suggesting the traces of colonial power through the residue of sonic history. Tangled electrical wires are ubiquitous on the streets of Vietnam, and public loudspeakers were installed during its resistance war with France in the 1950s. They were used for French propaganda and later used by the US military. The soundtrack blasting through the loudspeakers include musical sounds, a song by French Legion soldiers, Vietnamese Catholic chanting, and an American pop song popular in Vietnam during the war. So I'm going to end with just a brief mention of this project called Treatment for a Year of the Rabbit, which uses sound, video, and photography to visually deconstruct cinema in relationship to the experience and memory of the American war in Vietnam. So there's a few videos in here, and then also these photographs are video stills from archival videos, photographs that were made from video stills of archival videos taken by soldiers, American and Australian soldiers, that were taken during rest and relaxation. So they were just like moments where they were filming the landscape and would kind of catch like a female figure walking by and then would follow it for like literally a second or two before it, they would lose it. So I made stills from these moments where there were these sort of really voyeuristic moments. So the project is about deconstructing kind of cinema, the ways that we tell stories and in relationship to the memory of the war in Vietnam, to really think about how we tell stories and also how can we tell stories with what we have left of what those stories are. And it was kind of, in a way, a kind of searching for my mother's story. All of this footage was taken before 1975, which would have been when my mother would have been in Vietnam and walking around the streets of Saigon during that time. So I'm going to show just a quick video clip from this piece in the show, which is called I Have Been to the Place Where You Left Your Family. And the video is very simple. It's an animated photograph that I took the first time I went back to Vietnam of my aunt, who was reading a letter from my mother, who she hasn't seen. They've never re-met, like my mom's never been back to Vietnam. So in the photograph, she's reading the letter that my mom, gave to me to deliver to my aunt. So let me try to get to that video, and I'll end with this. Sure. Okay. And I will just end there since I'm out of time, but looking forward to being in conversation, and I will pass it back to Ji-Yeon. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you, Taz, Gina, Hong-an, for those really inspiring and moving presentations. I've been told that we have a little bit more time for our discussion until about 2:10. We'll just have a slightly shorter break. And so I don't want us to feel rushed through the discussion portion. I just wanted to start actually with something really striking that Gina said, which is that we need to find the perspective that liberates us. And I was thinking that in each of your presentations, you shared with us an object or objects that were quite, hostile and violent, right? Whether it is like the no sign with the moon and the star, and we can interpret it very generously or most likely as it was intended, or the stereo cards that Gina shared with us, or those images, the first images that showed us from the war. And the idea of finding perspective that liberates us suggests that there's a way of looking at these, incredibly violent images and objects. There's a way to look at them that is liberating. And I feel like all of your art attempts to do that. But I was wondering if you could each talk a little bit about that process, right? What are the challenges of confronting these objects? How do you work through them to get to a point that feels a little bit more like liberation? And so Gina, if you don't mind, we'll start with you, and then I'll sort of move down, Hong-Lan and Taz.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it was really central to the writing of the novel, because a lot of the research that I did was really research on trauma. What I found was that the voices of the Filipinos were really invisible, were really unheard. They weren't documented at all, but the voices of the soldiers, the voices of the colonizers, the Senate hearings, there were really long Senate hearings on the Philippines, on the occupation of the Philippines in 1900 through 1946, when the Philippines, was so-called free, became a republic. But so one structure of reading that I do is really an inverse structure. You read how they read the Filipino, and I invert it. I just read, the truth is going to be a form of inversion of whatever of the white supremacist has said, because the view of the white supremacist is so distorted. It's so distorted in terms of the Filipino, and it's so obvious in almost all these places. So one of the analytic moves that I'm always doing as a writer is inversion. And so that's what I can talk about that a little bit more, but reading from the lens of the colonizer means you have to invert that concept of the Filipino as lazy, or whatever it is that they talk about the Filipino, and recognize the acts of resistance and the resistance in being lazy, or the ways in which you read humor, for instance, in the ways Filipinos tackle this history. So I'm going to be honest, even though my novel was about trauma, it was a comic novel.
Hong-Lan?
Oh, yes. Yeah, excellent question. I think for me, I draw a lot on sort of thinking about Ariella Azule's work and her writing on decolonizing photography, and the idea of kind of really interrogating that moment of contact, the moment of the photographer being, photographing the subject, that exchange, and thinking about that exchange not being just like a one-way street, right? And for me, it's always about trying to call attention to the viewer's relationship to what they're seeing, right? Trying to call attention to the subject position and make the viewer try to have a recognition of their own position as they're viewing it. And I think I try to do this through a kind of stilling of the image oftentimes. It's my impulse to kind of still the video, to be like, wait, look here, like, what was this exchange? What happened? Like, this wasn't just a passing moment. How do we wrest this moment from the kind of, the graveyard of historical material and interrogate just that little moment, right? And so there's a kind of, kind of liberation of that moment, so that there's an openness to really having a more radical relationship to what you're seeing. And to me, it really is about changing and really like shifting and radicalizing the way that we've been, acculturated and indoctrinated to look. That our looking is not without its ideological, the machinery of ideological, culture, like has trained us to look in certain ways. So I think for me, it really is about trying to like make those moments really still and to reinterrogate them by, there's juxtaposition, but also the stilling and things, images in relationship to other things like sound or text, things like that.
I think for me, I was 21 when September 11th happened. So my adult life has been really framed by this Islamophobia framework. Just this constant, whether it's like September 11th racial profiling backlash, or all the way up to what we've been seeing pre-Trump getting elected to now. And I think there's a way that we've been seeing activism happening where there's this kind of idea of like, we need to humanize ourselves. Like, we Muslims need to humanize ourselves and be a part of dinner table conversations so people can see that we're human, which I'm very anti that, because I don't think that we need to be doing things to humanize ourselves, because we are human. But that was like a frame of thinking that was happening. And then there's also disrupting, being a rebel, pushing back on like what the mainstream narrative is saying, that they need to be thinking of Muslim Americans and Muslim American artwork. And I think that's kind of, I didn't share some of that artwork, but I do have art where I feel like my Muslim Valentine's Day cards, where I'm intentionally making people feel uncomfortable for them to self-critique, and doing it in humorous ways. And I think for me, like what you were asking, like these objects, like that sign on the freeway, that was a very violent sign, just to like drive under that every day and seeing that still up there, and that no one else had taken it down. And then like we had to have this like secret underground network of trying to figure out how to take that down. Like that's traumatic, that's trauma. But I think that we have to do it. We have to take down the signs. Turning into the art is like, I guess, was just my way of like healing that, or trying to turn it on its head and to turn something else into it. But I don't know. I like so much of like what it means to be Muslim American as an activist and an artist for the past 2 decades has been a little bit of trauma porn. A lot of like, sharing our the violence that we've experienced, the hate crimes that we've experienced. And I think there's a place for that, but we also need to share our stories, and we need to share, like, build community. And we also need to find joy with each other to move forward. And I think that's kind of the rope that we've been like walking on, just trying to find that balance.
Taz, that actually leads directly into my second question, which was, the risk. On the one hand, there's this incredible urgency to grapple with, these images and representations that are so burdensome, right? That are violent and burdensome, and that affect and shape the way that people can think and talk about their lives, right? Or even go about their lives. On the other hand, there is the danger of sort of reducing like the possible number of stories that we can tell to that kind of confrontation, right? With that kind of violence. And so I was wondering, and I think in each of the works that you presented, you can kind of see a hint of that other aspect, right? Of the kind of the love or the celebration, what can't be just kind of, what isn't just trauma, right? Like kind of seeping out. And so I was curious to hear actually each of you talk a little bit about that balancing act, right? On the one hand, the kind of urgency you feel, right, to be somebody who engages and invites and makes change, and on the other hand, I think the equally important need to make sure that visibility or telling one's story is not ever reduced to that in itself, right? That there's a kind of another level of and different affects, right, that can come out. And so, let's see. Owen, would you mind starting us off in this instance?
Sure. I'm still thinking about it, because I feel like for Vietnamese people, I don't know. For me, it's just like like, I just grew up with like the culture in my family, and I think probably many Vietnamese families feel this way. Like, there's just such an intense focus on sorrow, like chia buồn, like sad all the time. Like, there's an intense focus on that, in terms of like, I feel like it's really built into the way that we understand ourselves and our history. And so I think that, yes, you know, in terms of that balance of like what it is to deal, like, for me, it's more about like, how do we like understand the trauma as it's kind of wound up and sort of inextricable from our daily lives, right? So for me, it's not necessarily about this sort of like opposite balance, but more about just sort of like, how does it actually manifest all the time? And it's not like we're just crying all the time, you know what I mean? So I think that for me, it's more about just like, I think for me, it's really important that we're addressing these, that we talk through these things, because it's also Vietnamese families, like, you know, it's very, very difficult to talk about these things. And I'll say there's this really amazing short documentary by Carol Nguyen called No Crying at the Dinner Table that I'll plug. I don't know her, but she's really amazing. And it's a wonderful short documentary that's on Vimeo right now. And it kind of addresses this very question of just like the working through of trauma for individual families. So again, I think for me, it is like, that process is powerful, and that's also meaningful. And I think it is also joyful for me too, you know, like, it's transformative, you know, like when I started making work, and, you know, I didn't want to show it to my family, but slowly I did start to share it with my family, with my parents. And, you know, it's really hard, but I feel like it did slowly transform their understanding of me, and opened us up to different kinds of conversations. So I think that, and that's joyful, you know, ultimately it changes the fabric of who we are when we kind of can accept and understand and work through these questions in a way that understands that these things don't end. These wars never end, you know, the residue of this violence doesn't end even after generations. So.
It's wonderful. Thank you. Taz, and then Gina to close us.
I mean, it's such a complicated question. I think the thing that I was thinking about was the podcast Good Muslim Bad Muslim was, I mean, we're not recording anymore, but it was considered a comedy podcast, and we went into it being like a conversational political podcast. And I think like we were recentering our conversation, like two different Muslim women from very different backgrounds and very different perspectives, telling our unique stories and just like what it means to be Muslim American. We would have like segments like Creeping Sharia and like Awkward Ask a Muslim. And it was just like us talking. But that in itself was just so political depending on who was listening, or it was so funny depending on who was listening. And that's the contradiction of our title, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. Like the framing of who thought we were good and who thought we were bad was just kind of applied to us. And I think that's kind of, that's kind of how I address trauma, I guess. Like it can't be something separate, and it can't be like, we can't, like it has to be like, in the recentering of yourself, you're going to incorporate all these things of yourself, and the recentering of your community and the recentering of your community's stories. You're going to bring all these aspects to yourself, and that in itself is the political act. I think that's kind of what I was thinking about when you were asking that.
Thank you so much. I think we have another minute. Gina, if you have some last thoughts.
My thoughts are really just connected to what they said, and the fact that I thought it was very interesting that you're talking about Vietnamese and sorrow, whereas I have to deal with Filipinos and puns and humor. You know, we have there's a diner that has menus right now of under the Duterte regime of tinorture na pork chop, you know, tortured pork chop. And so they're using language in this way that recognizes trauma, using it in some way that also resists trauma, that also falls into trauma. And I think being able to recognize how our lens is powerful and multiple always is really, for me, a part of the work that I do, and to just do it. You know, my novels have multiple perspectives, move into multiple storytellings, and I just do the work that I feel needs to be done given the history I have. And that risk taking and boldness, I think, is part of that huge pleasure that we do take as artists, and we hope that readers too gain from that.
Thank you all so much for your incredible presentations and also this conversation, which I hope we'll be able to continue with the audience during the Q&A. But that concludes our first panel today. Many thanks to Taz, Gina, Holan for this discussion. And so now we're going to have a brief break. The webinar will remain open, so you'll see a holding slide on your screen. And so you don't need to sign out or leave. And then we will resume at 2:15 promptly. Thank you all.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone, to the second session of the Stories We Tell and the Objects We Keep, Asian American Women and the Archives. I am Kimby Phillips, the curator for race and ethnicity at Radcliffe Schlesinger Library. I have the pleasure of working with donors to acquire new collections and my library colleagues to process, describe, and make those collections available to the public. At Radcliffe Schlesinger Library, we are intergenerationally minded. We think about both the past and the future and consider how best to document the lives and experiences of women whose stories have been entrusted to us. And the importance of archives has recently been underscored by a heated public debate about the historical experiences of Korean women living under the control of the Imperial Japanese Army before and during World War II. Archival records can not only support or dispel scholarship, they can also help us to combat injustice, leaving roadmaps of past activism to guide current efforts to fight injustices like the recent rise in violence against Asian Americans across the nation. Now, I was honored to participate in the planning committee for this program with Professors Ju-Young Kim, Ajantha Subramanian, and Shigehisa Kuriyama, and my Radcliffe colleague, Rebecca Wasserman. I am now happy to introduce Vanessa Hu. She will offer another student's perspective on our themes. Vanessa is a rising sophomore at Harvard College studying computer science, ethnicity, migration, and rights. After gaining interest in haikus beyond their 5-7-5 structure, she wrote this piece entitled How to Write a Haiku, pondering how to possibly capture our memories and existences of the past year in any sort of form. Once Vanessa has concluded, we will move directly into our second panel, Preserving Our Stories, which will be moderated by Denise Kaur, Assistant Professor of American Studies at UMass Boston. Vanessa, the floor is yours.
How to write a haiku. I recall last March, perched atop my windowsill, gazing at the yard. Pen in hand, boxes at the door, tuba music in my ear. I am not sure what moved me. Maybe it's because I always liked how CDs stacked into shelves. Maybe it's because I always swallowed the tide a tad too long, and all that resurfaces for air are 3 lines scribbled in the margins. But I was foolish to think that it was just a matter of slotting syllables in step, that it was just a matter of laying arms down at my feet. For all the solitude that Basha's frogs and Issa's cats bathed in from literary suns, I didn't know that these refrains could just be the first strike of the drum, before the winds whistle in with 7/7s. I didn't know about those pivotal characters that sliced yet tethered valleys between ideas, that took you by the hand back to where it all began. And I didn't know how present they were, to describe the season of winter or love, and the session of whatever capacity I am in, to see a fox sprinting across a suburban Jersey street, to notice perfect strips of sun through the blinds warming my bed at 1:54 p.m., to embrace the snug of worn jeans on my hips, to hallucinate words with raindrops on the cheek. It was as if I'd sensed that it was never just about the peonies, but the quips of writers now adrift in oscillations. Things that were said, yet were never released from the lips or pen. And so I wonder if that is what burrowed into me across alphabets and revolutions, how I could only hope this bottle would reach where the sirens churned before the language was lost. And I love these dilating garden walls, so much ivy to gather in the palm and twist between the tongue. But I began to wonder, why couldn't the stones topple? Why should I tend to the seasons? Why should I believe there must be any in the prosody of flowers? And why should I appraise grace in inches stretched, times revised, pounds shifted, roots ripped? The calibrations muddy the questions running upstream. To sever the head off a form, does that make an artist? To burn the clouds that sink the canoe, does that create divinity? To speak algorithmic prose that runs past constants, Does that add up to one? And to tie syllables onto branches and carve hollows for notes and lovers. Do the arteries thrum in a novel sort of existence? Ladders splinter into stars and tomorrows slip into the surf. My limbs don't recall how to build castles for the moon to taste and the tide to swallow. Like the songs and mittens sheltering against New England ice, or the lavender and nerves tucked in laundry washed at midnight, or the bitter leaves and laughter mingled in spilled tea at the dinner table. I imagine the poets etch in similar shadows, the silky creases in calendars that can't be pressed smooth. And I too violate the governance of time, skipping moments atop my eyelids like pebbles in a stream, across resurfaced pasts and watery dreams. On top of these linked verses, lean encyclopedias that smudge the graphite. Entries slide out, cutting words that only piece together when I am alone in the attic. Perched atop that windowsill, 4 flights above the shifting dust, I tried to assemble those slivers to lift into the wind. Perhaps all I needed to know was how to send a heartstring through a prism. A cat print in the snow, a nightjar soaring too high, a pearled hail to cup in my hand and let dissolve into shape. Back then, delineating threes and estimating heartbeats, I had yet to know that I still don't know which comes first, the aerodynamics or the desire to fly. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second session, Preserving Our Stories. My name is Denise Kaur, and I will be serving as moderator. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists. Renee Tajima Pena is Professor of Asian American Studies and Director of the Center for Ethno-Communications at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her documentary filmmaking work includes the award-winning Who Killed Vincent Chin, and most recently, the PBS documentary miniseries, Asian Americans. Wendy Maruyama is Professor Emeritus in the School of Art and Design of San Diego State University and renowned artist, woodworker, and furniture maker. Tana East is the author of the critically acclaimed novel Bright Lines and founder of the Brooklyn-based beauty and fragrance company High Wildflower. Our session today considers the preservation of objects within the archive. And I'd like to open the session with just a few short remarks. I'd like to start actually not with an object, but with an image. The image that I have in mind is a painting dated from 1818. It is by Caspar David Friedrich, and it is called The Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. A young man is pictured and his back turned toward us. He is standing on a cliff looking across a fog-shrouded landscape. Nothing is in view here, not the man's face, not the vast landscape he looks out into. A historian described this painting and the view from it as that of historical consciousness. It is a view that is both sweeping and majestic, lifting us out of what is familiar, letting us see beyond our time and place. And it is this that he called the landscape of history. The session today asks us to consider another view of history, to think of the object, something that is tangible and that we can perhaps hold, something that can be kept closer to the heart. Each of our panelists today will talk about the object as a way to produce alternative and even oppositional archives. How are objects kept and for whom? How do objects carry not only individual memories, but also historical memories? How does the archive take shape and offer us ways to tell the multiple and complex histories of Asian American women? After the presentations from our speakers today, they will all come back on screen and join me in conversation. One note about this. Wendy Mariyama will be relying on closed captioning during the discussion portion of the session. She has asked me to share this information with our audience as there might be a slight delay between my question and her reply. With that, let's get started. It is my pleasure to pass the virtual floor over to Renee Tajima-Pena.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. It's great to be back at Radcliffe. I actually was able to make my first film because of this place. I'd been rejected from the film major at Harvard, and Martina Horner, who was the president of Radcliffe when I was a student, gave me and my classmate Corinne McIntosh, who's a Grenadian American student, she gave us money to go to Grenada and make a film about Morris Bishop and the New Jewel movement. They had just ousted the dictator, Eric Gary. We didn't know what we were doing, but we made a film there. So Radcliffe has always been really an oasis of possibility in the desert that's Harvard. And it's no coincidence to me that it's Radcliffe launching this really important initiative in ethnic studies, and not Harvard, which is still pretty much a backwater of tenure denials and bizarre papers on game theory and sex trafficking of Korean comfort women that can be mentioned. But I'll get to my object. My objects are digital. I mean, they are kind of 3D, if you can see this, for me and on hard drives. But you know, my currency is the visual image when I make films. So today I'd like to show you a clip from the docuseries Asian Americans that was on air last May. And it's a docuseries I produced with a whole team of Asian American filmmakers. And I chose a clip about Patsy Mink, the kind of pioneering politician. I chose it because when I was growing up, my grandfather, Hidehachi Ujie, always used to say that I could be another Patsy Mink. Of course, I was never, but that was his dream. And my grandfather, who immigrated to Hawaii in 1902, he worked on a sugar plantation and cut cane. Then he made his way to the mainland and for years worked at, you know, jobs like janitorial jobs as a stock boy. For 50 years, Grandpa was considered an alien ineligible for citizenship. That meant that he had no path to citizenship because he was Asian. And so I never really realized what Patsy Mink meant to him until I started working on the series. So this clip from the series, and this episode was directed by Leo Chang. It picks up just after Patsy Mink has lost her first bid for Congress. So if you can go to the videotape.
She lost very badly. And it's very clear that sexism played a key role. People who voted for Inouye wrote to me to say, I didn't vote for you because you're not a man. I know that he's going to be able to go to Congress and he's going to be able to engage these backroom deals because he's a man. For her to be basically stabbed in the back by the Democratic Party, the party that she helped to build, was really emotionally devastating for her. But she regrouped.
And down there on the floor, addressing the convention in support of the Platform Committee recommendation on civil rights, is Mrs. Patsy Takimoto Mink. Let's listen to her.
Depends upon your conscience and conviction.
In the back rooms of the convention, Southern senators pushed to water down the civil rights platform. Patsy Mink takes the room by storm in a speech that urges delegates not to compromise. Her presence sends a bold message that civil rights matter to all Americans, including Asian Americans.
I urge you to support the platform as written by your platform committee and to give this nation one of the greatest weapons of peace, the winning of the respect and admiration of the entire world. Thank you very much.
The delegates vote overwhelmingly to stand their ground on civil rights. In 1964, Patsy Mink takes another long-shot run for Congress, once again without the blessing of the party leadership. With an all-volunteer staff and her husband John as her campaign manager, This time, she wins.
When my mother was elected in 1964, there were only 11 women in the House of Representatives. And she was the first and only woman of color ever elected at that point to the US Congress.
When I was a student in Hawaii, I was, on food stamps, and I was a kid who had to work, 2 jobs just to be able to get through college. And she looked out for those folks. She looked out for minorities, and she looked out for women. You walk around these halls, she was short, she was easy to dismiss, but she just wouldn't let them dismiss her. What she did for women's rights and equal rights with Title IX a half century ago is a remarkable achievement, not just for Asian Americans, not just for women, not just for people from Hawaii, but for all Americans.
I love that picture of her. So there's an archival story behind this clip that really speaks to the politics of the archive. So we knew from, as we were developing the series, that in newspaper articles, Patsy Mink had come out of nowhere in 1960. This was before she was ever elected. In fact, she had just, really lost badly. But she came out of nowhere at the 1960 Democratic National Convention and gave this major speech to convince the delegates to stand firm on the civil rights platform. And we knew the convention was filmed, but we couldn't find a trace of her speech anywhere, not the CBS archives, no archives, anywhere. But I've been making documentaries about Asian Americans for a long time. And I knew that either 1, we weren't pictured, or 2, if we were pictured, often nobody bothered to index that footage or those images or preserve it. So I told our researchers to try to find the white people who spoke that day in the index. It's sort of like Gina's inversion workaround. And I said, well, look at the footage before them and after, and sometimes you'll find the Asians in between. And sure enough, they found this clip of Patsy Mink. And when I saw it, I thought, well, first we were like elated. Then I thought, well, maybe my grandfather had actually seen this news report in real time. And I'm sure for him, seeing Patsy Mink there, in this national stage really meant to him that a news story could be written by his grandchildren. So the archive is about power, it's about representation, but it's also about change. And it's tangible, visible evidence that we were there and that we matter. And as other speakers have referred to, if we're excluded from the archive, that becomes fertile ground for the false narratives. That's when you get a narrative that, comfort women were gig workers contracting out their sexual services to the Japanese military. That's when you get those false master narratives. So this is really a call to disrupt the archives and make it our own. So now I'd like to pass the mic over to Wendy Maruyama.
Thank you, Renee. I just wanted to, I am going to start immediately with a photograph of my mother and her siblings that was taken in 1937, maybe 1938. And you can see that they are celebrating Gorge Day, which was the traditional Japanese holiday. And this photo was taken in San Pedro, which is where they lived before the war broke out. Next slide. As an object maker, the word object is very important to me. I love objects, but I also love to make objects. And I also feel that objects are very sentimental. They can mean so much just by laying your eyes on them. This is some of the work that I made for my exhibition, Executive Order 9066. And as you can see, this is a Japanese doll. Next slide. Entombed in tar paper behind glass. When my mother's family had to leave their homes to be evacuated from California, they pretty much had to give up all their material goods and belongings, including things that they had brought back from Japan. Next slide. Objects were broken in order to reduce the amount of objects that they had to destroy. They broke them, they burned them. My grandmother burned all of the family photographs and dishes and the like. Next slide. So this, you don't see it in the slide, but the doors kind of collide with one another. And in a way that was symbolic of the discord within families that took place during this forced evacuation. Next slide. Objects made. I mean, many of you may know of the beautiful objects that Japanese Americans made while they were incarcerated in the camps. Specifically, these little hand-carved birds. Next slide. I feel like the act of making objects was very therapeutic and perhaps allowed people to sort of escape in their own world while creating these objects. Next slide. This is a very iconic photograph by Dorothea Long, taken of Manzanar. These people were headed for Manzanar from the Bay Area. And you can see that they all have these paper tags that they've worn. Next slide. And some of these tags were saved by people who did go to camp. And so these are examples of the original tags that were used during the Executive Order 9066. Next slide. I decided that I wanted to remake each tag to represent each person that was sent to the camp. And in order to do that, I went into the National Archives where I found, it's amazing what you can find in the National Archives. I was able to find every name that was in the database. And the first page shows my family's friends who were from Chula Vista, California. And what was really incredible was to be able to go through all the names and I would see their faces appear in front of me, even though they've been long gone. Next slide. The process of recreating the slides was, the tags was monumental. I had to have these tags custom made so that they were exactly the same size as the original. Next slide. I also had rubber stamps made so that the text replicated the text that was on the original. Each Japanese family was given a number, and so each person was identified by the number. Next slide. In order to be able to complete 120,000 tags, I realized that I needed to make it a community project. I started out by creating small kits that were sent to different individuals and families. A lot of the families requested the numbers and names of their own relatives and ancestors. Next slide. I felt it really important to go to the local high schools because when I was in high school, there was no mention of Executive Order 9066. So the recreation of these tags to me was to kind of almost get back at the fact that I was not taught this when I was in high school. So I wanted these students to experience what it was like to write down all these names. Next slide. This is another high school group, and you can sort of see how the organization was for each table. They each had a separate job. Next slide. I also went to the Buddhist temples and the Japanese Christian churches. This was taken at the Buddhist temple. Next slide. What was amazing about being at the Japanese Christian churches and the Buddhist temples was that many of the people who volunteered were in the camp. So they were able to talk to people next to them and explain what their experiences were like. Next slide. I felt it really necessary to take the project to the East Coast, particularly in the South. And so I took the project to Tennessee and had a group of students volunteer doing these tags. Most of them had never really seen Japanese names before, much less write them down. So I think it was kind of a learning experience for them as well. Next slide. After the tags were all made, then they got a nice little bath and coffee to kind of give them sort of an aged appearance. Next slide. I also went to Japanese American senior homes too, where many of the people who were living there were former incarcerated. And it was really meaningful for them to handle the tag of people that they knew. Next slide. This is the final installation, and it was imperative to me that the inaugural exhibition was held in Arkansas, in Little Rock, Arkansas, because we have two camps that were located in that state, Roller and Jerome. Next slide. And this is a photograph showing some of the artifacts that were made in the camp. It was important to me to be able to display these objects along with the tags. And the outcome that I was looking for was so that people could see the sheer scale of, the population that was sent to camp by seeing the groupings. I think that's it. Thank you very much. Now we're next to Tanae. Thank you.
Wow, Wendy, that was really incredible. I'm so moved. Like Wendy, I love objects as well, and I'm a writer and a perfumer. And for me, perfume has always been a way to access times and peoples that I cannot access in physical proximity, but I can access them with materials that are taken from the earth. I'd love to read from my next book, Incensorium, and I want to touch on some of the objects of note in this work. So fragrance is something that becomes embedded in textiles, and I'm actually sitting next to a textile from my late grandmother. She stitched it. These are all the little stitches that she did when she was alive. She actually passed away last year, and this is right when, the virus was taking hold, and the conditions that she died in alone without her family nearby, just as I was supposed to see her, really made me think of the arc of one person's life, the objects that they make, the objects that we keep, and how it's shaped by forces much greater than them, and how our grandmothers and mothers pass down these objects that are created as acts of survivorship. So I'd like to read from my book Incensorium, and this is from an essay called Other Tongue. My mother sewed dresses for me and my sister throughout our girlhood, adding her own touches to McCall's patterns that she scored at Walmart. Pretty cotton florals and ginghams, ruffled taffeta and silk, much less expensive than store-bought. We wore our Bengali clothes for a Saturday dawat, parties that our parents threw on the weekend. This is when our double life emerged, when we retired our American selves. We dressed up for these dawats, drawing from our mother's inner sanctum of luxury, textiles and gold, a material culture much richer than so-called fast fashion American clothes made in Bangladesh that we wore to school. Saris hold the history of conquest. Floral Jamdani Muslim saris are the modern-day version of Bengal's mythic, legendary Dhakai Muslim, once loomed in the capital city of Dhaka. Mughal rulers called this bafta hawa, woven air. Weavers loomed this fabric at an 1800 thread count so fine that it could be tucked inside of a matchbox. We hear the story that Dhakai died out because the British chopped off weavers' thumbs and they revolted. Whether or not this is true has been debated. We'll never know for sure. As the British exploited Bengal for raw cotton used in their own factories, they sold these textiles back to the people at much higher prices. Capitalism made Dhakai Muslim extinct, dooming these textiles to live in the afterworld of the museum, diaphanous as ghosts. Whereas fine Jamdani and Katan silk exude elegance, they aren't as available as the Tant sari. Tant handloom cotton saris are iconic Bengal, made from threads of recycled scraps, spun, cut, starched by women, worn by poor and rich women alike, sturdy enough to last a lifetime. My mother's cachet of finery held our secret self, our rich self, our dripping in 24K gold self, our ancient self, our Bangla Muslim self, a shadow self, the war survivor who made sure her children ate every grain of rice on the plate, collected loose change in a jar, saved everything today because tomorrow was never guaranteed. On some weeknights, Ma worked concessions at the movie theater, and she'd come home exhausted, but treat us to leftover popcorn or nachos, junk food that we'd never dream of buying unless it were free. Each night I rubbed her swollen feet, scented like buttery popcorn and faded jasmine. Jasmine summons our foremothers, voluptuous and strong and feminine, but what makes it unforgettable is what makes it dirty. Indole gives jasmine its intoxicating narcotic note, the aura of shit. Animalic not only in scent, but at sight, jasmine absolute is thick and viscous as menstrual blood. Absolutes are another incarnation of the flower, extracted by a solvent. And when I work with these materials in dilution, it shears the white floral notes, making the oil smell like the living thing. Avasana is a perfume that we know from other lifetimes. In the ancient Hindu tradition, a sense of cosmic deja vu, a scent that we've encountered before. And these vasanas are imprinted in textiles, traces of perfume and natural body oils and dirt locked into the weave of vintage silk, cotton, polyester, holding the memories of the wearer. My first vasana of jasmine was from when I was about 7 years old, summertime trip to New York City to visit our grandmother. I arrived very sick. I couldn't stop throwing up the bitter medicines for my bronchitis, so my nanu dipped a pair of cotton balls in her jasmine attar, jasmine flower steeped in sandalwood oil, and tucked the perfume into my ears. I lay with my head in her lap until the scent of the attar lulled me to sleep. In each breath, I experienced illness, relief, love, family, and history. And on that trip to New York, in my nanu's lap, a serene new sense of home. I weave my family's stories of surviving the war into the narratives that I come across of the Bangladeshi archive, the Liberation War, where women's stories are so often missing from the permanent record. I come across the story of a volunteer during the war who helped free Bangladeshi women held hostage in cantonments by the Pakistan Army. And when she held their naked bodies in the embrace of a sari, the scrap stirred the maternal muscle memory, draping themselves in soft cotton, worn down by the oils of their sweat and skin, returning them to femininity, modesty, a wild relief after months living in a nightmare, returning them to a time before war. Thank you so much. I'd like to hand it back to Denise.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you so much, everyone. I have, I'm going to ask actually each person a question, and I think I'm just going to go in order in the way that you presented. You know, so the first question goes to Renee. You know, I love what you said about sort of the ways in which filmmaking and, you know, can be kind of like a way of creating a new archive, you know, a sort of, you know, way in which that, you know, new stories can be told. And particularly, you know, when we think about the archive, as you know, sort of said so nicely, as that being sort of produced by relationships of power, in which, you know, there is, you know, that there's so many of these stories that are and cannot be apprehended in the official record. And, you know, that sort of clip that you showed from Patsy Mink is just, I think it's a powerful example of this. You know, I was actually also thinking about other films that you've made. I was remembering, for instance, this moment in your film, My America, or Honk If You Love Buddha. And, you know, that just, you know, a scene with you with being on the road with Yuri Kochiyama. And just like, what a precious moment. You know, Yuri is no longer with us. She passed away in 2014, but, you know, like, we have this moment thanks to your film. And so I'm wondering, Renee, what kinds of thoughts you have had in looking back at your filmmaking, how you've thought about things while, you know, perhaps how you thought about things when you were filming at a given moment. And then looking back now, perhaps from a different vantage point, what are your thoughts? How does the passage of time shape how you think about filmmaking, history, and the archive?
I think, well, you know, I also teach documentary and Asian American studies right now. And my students, I tell my students, well, you're writing the first draft of history. It doesn't matter that you're a student, because a lot of material I've used for different films, No Mas Bebes, which was about immigrant Mexican women who were sterilized coercively at LA County Hospital, or My America and the Asian American series, is the images and the footage we used were created actually by Chicano students, Asian American students, you know, people here in Los Angeles, at UCLA, the first affirmative action program, Ethno-Communications, formed by the Mother Muckers, this kind of roguish group of students of color who said, look, we've got to open up this university to students of color and new filmmakers. And they shot that stuff. I mean, it's among the only images of our communities that are just, you know, human, not about gangs, not about only Lunar New Year or whatever. So it's just crucial that we don't only shoot it, but we preserve it. And so one confession I'll make is when I got out of college, I was first at Asian Cinevision. I was like the first paid staff person there. And during around 1980, 1981, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Incarceration of Citizens, the hearings on the Japanese American concentration camps were, you know, going around the country. And it came to New York, and Yuri Kochiyama, Bill Kochiyama, and all these really amazing Issei and Nisei survivors of the camps testified. And we filmed it. But I lost it. Like, you know, I was like 21. I don't know what was, I wasn't even thinking that this was important to keep. So I've been making up for that ever since. I mean, somebody found the Chicago hearings, videotape of the Chicago hearings while we were making the series. They found it in a closet somewhere in a school in Chicago. And I said, I'll pay for it. We have to digitize it, because I remember just like the grief. I live with constant grief that those voices are not, and those images will never be seen because I was such an idiot. My confession. Okay, that's it. Zoom.
I mean, I think in itself that, just like how much that goes into that, in that documentary film that, that you're filming is sort of incredible. I always think that, documentary filmmakers actually make some of the best historians. I mean, I think, that you're even, that all of, it's like so much of that sort of material. It's really wonderful. Wendy, I have a question for you. I'm just so moved by your artwork, your installation, and I wanted to ask you a question about the TAG project. It's such a powerful installation. I'm so struck by, the tags as you've sort of assembled them. They're sort of collective making, how they were created. They were bundled together and hung from a ceiling. And just, the image that you showed in your slide of them sort of hanging there, I can only imagine what a sight that was. From the images that you showed us, they almost look kind of ghostly in a way. And so I wondered actually if you could talk about the audience reception for this work. What was it like to present it in public? And do you have a sense of what people thought about it?
Thank you. That's a good question. I really had no expectations as to how people were going to respond to this work. But because it was such a collaborative experience that I think it's really hard for me to say that it's my project. I think it was everybody's project that volunteered. And we had one of the exhibitions in San Diego where many volunteers helped with the TAG project. And it was in a gallery, and when the doors opened, everybody came in and immediately they started looking for family members in the bundles. And people were like digging around and looking for names, and many of them found their parents or grandparents, aunts and uncles, and that was pretty rewarding to me. Although the gallery director was panicking because everybody was touching everything, but I said, no, that's okay, don't worry about it, But to me, that was kind of an unexpected response. But in the museum, like in Arkansas, for example, I think what people were the most taken by was the sheer numbers of tags, meaning how many people were forced into these camps, and how some of these camp locations, the population just ran up 20,000 people, like in Poston, which is outside, just in Arizona. So that to me was really the goal, for people to see the sheer number of people that was involved and forced into these camps. So, yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And a question for Tanais. So I think you've given us so much to really sort of think about, this sort of idea of, memory as sensory, as ephemeral. Even, as a way to think maybe even beyond the object, right? As something that, immaterial. And I was actually reading somewhere that scent was actually an important part of the writing of your other novel as well, Bright Lines, and that it was a line of connection for you between New York City and Bangladesh. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how some of these, to talk about some of these connections, how scent connects you to the different worlds you belong to. I mean, and perhaps even to your world as a writer.
Thank you for the question. I think a lot about how scent is a kind of parallel narrative to the text that I'm creating. I think of the text that I'm writing at this moment as weaving together scraps of the archive. And similarly, when you construct a perfume, you're taking scraps of olfactory material, trying to blend it in a synergistic, composition. And one of the things that I found, especially when I'm trying to summon place, which is such a different way to work with perfume materials than a lot of European white Western perfumery, is I'm trying to actually connect us to ancestral memory. So much of the colonial project was to turn us into caricatures of ourselves. The way that we smelled was one of the ways that we were judged. And I think that in spinning the narrative into and revisioning the narrative into fragrance, it's really wresting back the sort of way that white supremacy had to deem us ridiculous, smelling like we were, less evolved, less civilized, all these kinds of things that are really laced into our narrative. As a person who's of Bangladeshi Muslim descent, I'm also in conversation with another narrative of the hegemony of India and upper caste Hindu narratives that kind of place us outside of stories of representation in the Asian American landscape. It's often an Indian American story. So I'm getting really specific with scent by taking materials that I can use to build new ways of telling our story. One of the cool things that just happened is I got in touch with a fragrance seller in India, in the perfume capital of India, Kannauj. And he has materials that are iconic to our people, like mendi, henna for our hands, betel leaf, the pan that my grandma would chew with tobacco, roses steeped in sandalwood, jasmine steeped in sandalwood. And he has all of these materials for me to purchase. So we're creating this sort of transnational commercial relationship. But what he's allowing me to do by having access to these raw materials is to reconstruct a narrative of my people that in this time of the virus, I can't even access my people right now. So I think in terms of this fragrance's ability to allow us to travel, to summon narratives of our ancestors, it has been so powerful. But what makes it really powerful to me is that this is the sense that was really deemed lower than the sense of sight, since the Western world is so ocular centric, since so much of our archive we're forced to be mediated through white institutions, the university, the museum. This sort of, I don't know, it seeps into the places beyond that specter. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to it. It's very sensuous, without judgment. And it becomes fused with our memory in a way that I think we don't know exactly what's happening. And I think a lot about how another aspect of our selves that was taken from us is our connection to what is mystic or what is supernatural or what is something beyond this earthly life that has all been sort of seen as things that, are not worthy of pursuing academically or in literature. I mean, they're just seen as superstitions. And those are things that my grandmothers were really invested in a way. I mean, these are people who married at age 9 and age 13. So for me to be here speaking to you, it's like, how far has history taken us? And yet this object is still here. These earrings are still here, And these earrings tell a story of a broken marriage, of being an undocumented worker, working in a movie theater, not having access to healthcare, but it's still a symbol of finery for our people. So I'm always looking for how objects are laced with histories that we don't see at first. And I think fragrance really allows us to get in deeper in a way that we aren't.
Wow. Beautiful, thank you. And I think there's, I mean, actually everything that all of you have said, and there's so many connections actually with the other panelists as well. So that I think that'll be a really great, really rich discussion. This ends our second panel. I would like to thank Renee, Wendy, and Tanais very much for a very meaningful discussion. We'll now transition to the audience question and answer portion of our program. I welcome Ajantha Subramanian, Professor of Anthropology and of South Asian Studies and Chair of the Department of Anthropology at Harvard, to the virtual floor to moderate this discussion among the 6 panelists.
Thank you so much, Denise. And thanks to all of you. It was just an incredible, was it just 2 hours? It feels like it was much longer. I mean, it really was a really amazing experience to hear from all of you. And we do have a bunch of questions that have already come in, but I'm also inviting the audience to please submit more. We have a good 25 minutes, I think, for the conversation. So there's a lot that we can address. So please go ahead and submit questions, and I'm going to keep an eye on the Q&A box. Let me start with the questions that have already come in. One of the themes, and this runs across several of the questions, is about visibility and voice. So one of the questions was about how Asian American women might amplify our voices, how we can project our stories to a larger audience, and how we put our work front and center. And a related question was about how curators and editors, the people who sort of mediate the circulation of our work, whether they've had an impact on our ability to tell stories. And there's another interesting question which kind of links to these two, and it's about silence and absence. And the way I read this question was whether there is a virtue to silence and absence. So to put this all together, can you all speak to this call for visibility and voice, which sort of begs the question of who we want to be visible to? Who do we want to hear our stories? Who do we want to be the audience of our accounts? Which spaces do we want to claim? And is there a value in absence and silence? So this is sort of the first set of questions that I'd like us to speak to. So why don't I start with Gina? Do you want to start by addressing this question of audience visibility, voice, silence?
Thank you. And it's an excellent question. It's a question that always comes up. And I will say this about that question for me. My focus is how I'm going to write my narrative in the way that truth occurs to me. And the issue with that is that my truth may be complex, unknown, told in a way that strikes against the common ways, the more conventional ways of doing narrative, because I need to speak the layers of history, the transhistorical, the multiple perspectives that occur in, let's say, the stereo card. And that is not a simple work of art. There's something very simple about it in the sense that all it's asking for the reader is to be attentive and to hear the other and hear oneself as that other speaks. But we understand that the capitalist world of publishing does not exactly work according to truths, They work according to their interests and their designs. And my whole thing about that is I need to just speak my truth and find the ways that, and open myself to those who will publish my work. I cannot and I will not deal with those that expect me to do things any other way. Say, for instance, why do you have 2 wars instead of 1? What 2 wars is so confusing. Well, what the, it's not going to happen. So I do need to be very resisting of the concerns of the market, which really saddens my agent. but I think the truth that I need to speak is important to me. So the issue of visibility is not my problem. It is the problem of the public. It is the problem of the society in which we exist, which still refuses and will not immediately or even imagine in the long term dismantling white supremacy.
Thank you, Gina. Do any of the rest of you want to answer that question about visibility? And yeah, Taz.
I'll take a stab. I think one of the things that I want to push back on this question is what's the purpose of having a larger audience? When we created our podcast, it was very popular. We got millions of listens, but we weren't catering to the white people that were listening to our show. Within the first 6 months, we had people that were like, can you please define this term or that term? And we had to take a really specific stand that in the recentering of our conversations with each other, we weren't there to explain to the white gays. We were there just to explain to each other. And my goal in the podcast was to find that one, young South Asian girl in the middle of the country who didn't have access to anyone like her. So that was the audience I was catering to. And if other people listened along, then that was fine. Like, we weren't like saying this is just for us, but we're saying this is for this person and the rest of you can listen if you want to, but we're not catering our show to the rest of you. We're only catering it to this one person, which is why I want to push back on, there's no, the idea that to have success means you get larger audience or white gazes on your pieces is not really the purpose of telling the unique particular narrative that we need to tell for our communities. And one of the lessons we started realizing in the course of the podcast, by the time we got to like year 2, we were getting a lot of emails from white people that were listening to our podcast, and they say, well, I don't always understand what you're saying, but I'm really enjoying the podcast and I'm Googling, I'm learning. And I think there's something to be said about this idea of allowing other communities to eavesdrop into the conversations we're having and not dumbing our conversations down for that audience. And I know there was another question about how do we build solidarity? That is how you build solidarity with other communities, not dumbing down for this idea of how you're supposed to be, Why not just like have these honest conversations with your community? And if they learn something from the eavesdropping, I don't know, that's a form of solidarity that really made shifts in the work that I've done in how Muslims are perceived in this country. And I think that is definitely one way to do it.
If I could expand on that, because to use the term one struggle, many fronts to kind of talk about the marketplace, I think that there has to be all kinds of content, all kinds of stories to different audiences. I mean, it's sort of like, in art making, you can make conceptual work that's really vanguard, kind of disrupts the form, but, not a whole lot of people will see it. Or you can make kind of mass market art. And with, as a filmmaker, I mean, I see that in not only in my work, but I'm hearing this ecosystem of, people are doing highly commercial work, and maybe, just somebody who's never met an Asian American will just realize that we're human, we speak English, and sometimes we were born here. I mean, that's all they'll get out of it. And sometimes they'll get our audiences, our target audiences, which are very diverse and very big and broad. And, some in our audience will have the same kind of consciousness that, a non-Asian would have. So there's just different kinds of stories to be told and people to be reached.
Can I add to that too? I love what Taz said, because I think it's really important, especially in this moment where, as we know, capitalism feeds off the life of people of color, right? They can capitalize on these things for their own intention and only and continue to enforce and reify racial capitalism. So I think it's really important. So not just to be speaking to our people, right? And oftentimes I encounter this with my work. Sometimes, I have works that are not translated, for purposefully, and curators have said, can you translate that? I said, no, that's part of the work. And so I'll pull my work out of the show. And things like that. So I think it's really important to have that integrity, but also understand that there's also those positions, especially as we navigate these institutional relationships. And of course, as we're seeing, we're kind of having this moment, I think, for Asian American culture, right, in the US. And what we have to then navigate are these institutions and hold them to account, right? So it is speaking, having integrity, as Gina said as well, and sort of sticking to what, the integrity of your own work, but also using the power that you have once you start to have this visibility, or once you have relationships with these institutions, to hold them to account, so this even goes as far as like, my collaborator and I just canceled a performance at the MCA Chicago because of some controversies there, and pulling out of a panel recently from some institutions, and sort of dropping a sponsor of a panel from another thing in Canada. So it is about amplifying the conversation by also insisting on the framework around which we speak our stories. So it's not just a matter of inclusion and again, pushing back on the desire to just say we want to belong, we want to just be included. Viet Nguyen just had a really great interview on Between the Covers where he talks about this really eloquently. Whereas we have to push the conversation where we really challenge again the notion that the myth of the sort of the cohesive nation and what our role is in that, and in fact that push against a sense of nationalism that's coherent.
I'd love to say a word on absence and silences, because I do feel like I'm like working in a place where it's very silent, but it's not devoid of language, and I feel like we are trying to wrest back a place in history when we're creating our work. Like that's what I'm feeling from everyone's work, the people who have been erased, neglected, denuded of their resources, incarcerated in camps. And that, the pain of silence in that's something that our work is trying to illuminate. And I think like there's so much of a focus on representation and visibility, which I think is so important in some ways, but in other ways, I think it really turns us into a projection of like something much deeper and truer. When Gina's talking about truth, it's like I am trying to get to the truth in my work, but being kind of mediated by editors in this business that I'm in, like so many people read what I read for you guys today and we're like, this isn't a book. I don't see a book here. And there is a part of us that has to see through white supremacy, patriarchy, like all these systems that are like, you're not real, you're not legible, you're not a story, and still persist despite. And I remember like the deepest moment of silence I had around that is the pain and depression of not being seen, and how being rendered invisible as a Muslim, as a Bangladeshi, as a queer person, all these things forced me to really go inward and get right with my own work. Because I'm like, these people aren't going to get it. What do I think about my work? I'm writing to Taz because Taz is Bengali and Taz understands what I'm talking about. Like getting that specific, even more specific than Asian American. And I think we all connect to our people in our own ways and write to our people in our own ways. But that's where I had to go. I was like, does this resonate for people who share my history? And I think the most beautiful kind of like end to the arc, the painful arc of trying to get a place for this story, is finding a young mixed race editor of color who's femme, who like gets the work and is like of a new generation. And I think that's what we need to keep thinking of, is like, who are we writing our stories for? It's not just the old guard. It's like the people we're leaving our objects and stories behind for, to make them feel more legible. Like all the students that are tuning in to listen to us. I mean, there's just this beautiful like exchange, I feel like, when we really listen to our silence and our pain and our sorrow and let something beautiful emerge from that place. And don't feel ashamed or embarrassed of it. I feel like there's so much shame for like not winning and not being, you know, on top of your, you know, on top of the game or whatever. I don't know. But it's like, those are not very meaningful places for Asian American women and femmes. Like it hasn't really served us. So I'm really just like trying to respect silence and sorrow, and where history has really asked us to listen deeper, because I think that's what our work is all trying to touch.
We have so little time and there's so much to talk about. I want to ask, there are two other questions that I really want us to address. And one is about the sort of the scale of the narrative that we're going for, right? Whose history are we telling? And for most of you, there is this movement between specificity, right? I mean, Tanais, you spoke about it most clearly, to say, you know, that there's something hyper specific about the Bangladeshi experience, right? That has to be recovered not just from, you know, the history of empire, but the history of, you know, Indian hegemony, right? So there's a specificity to all of your accounts that come through so beautifully, and they come through through particular objects, right? Which serve as kind of mnemonic devices to get at these histories that often aren't told. But all of you are also talking about histories that are deeply interconnected, right? And they're interconnected, you know, through experiences of empire, of displacement, of marginalization, et cetera. So can you all speak to this relationship between specificity and interconnection in your work? And perhaps also link that to the sort of objects through which you tell these stories, right? These objects that serve as not just mnemonic devices, but serve as ways for you to repurpose them, right? To repurpose these histories, to tell a kind of counter narrative of what we already know. And I'd like to start with Wendy. I wonder if you, because, and I think in part because so many of you spoke about the history of Japanese incarceration, you know, when you presented. So, I mean, Wendy, you know, the story that you're telling is one that is so specific to the Japanese American experience, but it also obviously has this broader resonance for everybody who has been part of this event. So I'd love to start with you and then move to others.
You know, I think this work was mostly, it was really, I made myself do the research because my grandparents and my parents never talked about Executive Order 9066. So really, I'm kind of embarrassed because it wasn't until 2006 that I started reading up about all the camps and attending pilgrimages at different incarceration sites. And, you know, to be honest, I didn't really know very many Japanese Americans like myself, except for family. And so I kind of felt, in many ways, detached from my own community. And I don't know if it's because of the towns where I've grown up, but anyway, this experience was more about reconnecting with my people, so to speak, and to hear their stories. And then through the process of that, I met a lot of Muslim Americans who had just gone through 9/11. They were coming to all of our pilgrimages as well. There's a real bond between the Muslim Americans and Japanese Americans in that the people from people who have experienced Executive Order 906 that could really empathize more readily to what was going on with the aftermath of 9/11. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but it more speaks to my reaching out to various communities and also being a disabled Japanese American also has some effect on how I engage with other Asian Americans. I kind of felt it's hard, to feel accepted with disability. So, okay, that's it.
I mean, one of the things that really jumped out at me, Wendy, with your presentation was, how you took these tags on the road and you it became this incorporative exercise where there were so many different communities, including high school students and others who may not have ever been told this history, who were brought into it through this object that they were helping to make. So there itself, you see the object acting as a kind of connecting device, right? That crosses borders. Do any of the rest of you want to speak to this question?
As a maker, I can relate to the use of my hand and share that with others with a singular goal. It was just very, very unifying to some degree. So, I think, and then also objects that are tactile. And so the whole process of making these tags was all about touching and writing and reading and feeling. So that's kind of important to me.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to speak to this question?
I'd like to
specificity.
I think that one of the things, Ajanta, you were asking is so interesting because there's this idea of specificity, but it's also like what I'm exploring right now and learning right now is that things have been integrally interconnected, and part of the capitalist colonial project was erasing those interconnections for a sort of exploitative gain. So like, I'll take an example of turmeric, which actually comes from what is now called Vietnam in Southeast Asia, but is like one of the most iconic ingredients in India and has become hegemonized as an Indian thing, but it actually doesn't come from India. It comes from what we now call Vietnam. So I think in really going into material culture or objects, or as Wendy, took the tag and created community around that, I think that's part of our job, is really destabilizing this idea of what is, high culture, if it's literature or film or whatever, like that, that's not where these interconnected histories are. The wealth of Bengal once contributed to building India and Pakistan, and there was this like extensive trade that really shaped Indian history. But you won't hear about Bangladeshi women who made Indian history. We're actually not studied in India as a part of Indian history. We have Bangladeshi history, but that's a saying that our history started in 1971, which is absolutely ridiculous. So these notions of like time and nation and borders, those are all falsehoods that we are kind of, we're pushing against those boundaries to wrest back the connections that we have. Like I even have a Yuri Kochiyama story. I visited Yuri Kochiyama when I was 21 in her home where she was staying at the end of her life. And I interviewed her for my school thesis project. Like you, Renee, that dictaphone recording is like in my parents' house, like not in great shape. I wish I had transcribed it and digitized it, but I didn't because I was 21 and like didn't know like the greatness I was sitting among. But talking to her, we're both Asian American. I'm Muslim. She knew Malcolm X. That was the first autobiography I read to make sense of being a Muslim South Asian person in America, because Black Muslims were the first people who were Muslim on this land. So we're always in conversation in ways that are kind of pushing against these very specific histories that we've inherited. Like that idea itself to me feels like a falsehood that I'm trying to fight, with my art, where it's like Black history is the history of this land. It's not just like a thing to celebrate in 1 month. It is connected to Asian history. It has allowed us to be here. Black people have allowed us to be here. Native people have allowed us to be. Their histories have allowed us to have what we have here in this conversation today. So I don't know, I think like seeing the images of all those people making the tags, like it is so moving because it is an acknowledgement that what these Japanese people went through as their homeland was at war with this land, everyone is acknowledging that that's a part of their history, and that's very powerful.
You're out of time, but I do want, if it's okay, I'd really like whoever wants to respond to this question to do so before we pass it on.
I wanted to respond to, it was a big question, but so as a filmmaker, really, I think this question of specificity versus, or looking at the big picture, the specificity is almost a tactical decision. It's like, how do you get across like these, huge themes and these interconnections in a way that's digestible for the audience. And when you tell the Asian American story, it's like quite often a story that, people don't have a baseline of knowledge. So when we did the docuseries Asian Americans, you can imagine, country music got 13 hours. One white guy, Ernest Hemingway, is just about to get 6 hours. We got 5 hours to tell 170 years of all the breadth of Asian American history. So how do you do that? You really, for the audience, we chose to really look at these personal kinds of stories in order to kind of infiltrate it with these, the framing we had was, how empire shaped the Asian American story, systemic racism, why, after Reconstruction, Jim Crow and anti-Asian exclusion emerged, in parallel to each other, these kinds of the racial hierarchy, how that was built. And you ask about gatekeepers, the PBS suits really pushed back. This idea of the model minority is just so ubiquitous. They thought, why are you talking about these things? This is so harsh. And, we'd say, are you kidding me? This is anti-Asian exclusion, Jim Crow, colonialization, people couldn't be naturalized. the Chinese Exclusion Act, you think we have to put like lipstick on this pig? No way you can do that. But they just couldn't imagine the Asian American, in the space of struggle and contention. And that was a real fight. But our stories win. If we had aired in May of 2020 some like model minority series, about the great adventures of Asian America in May of 2020, in this time of, the fall of democracy, in this pandemic of hate, and disease, I mean, we would have, we would have been laughed out of the airwaves. But in that sense, however we constructed, whatever strategies we take, I think we have to self-determine our own story. We have to tell our own story. And that's an assumption that we can't always make because of the gatekeepers.
Oh, I really wish we could keep going. And I wish, we were all in the same place so we could go out together. But unfortunately, we have to call this to a close. So thank you all so much for your incredible work across so many genres. And just the sort of inspiration that you all provide. I'm going to now pass the floor to Helen Zia for concluding remarks. Helen Zia, who is the author of Last Boat Out of Shanghai, the epic story of the Chinese who fled Mao's revolution. She's also a former journalist and former executive editor of Miss Magazine. Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ajanta. And I do have the difficult task of offering some closing remarks to this amazing event. My heart is so full after hearing these inspiring wise women. And I think you'll all agree that our speakers were so generous with their insightful, provocative, personal, intimate stories. I'd like to thank all of the remarkable panelists for illuminating the depth and breadth of the multi-generational, multi-dimensional, transnational lived experiences that go right to the heart and soul of our beloved communities. And so I wanted to just share a few reflections that these presentations brought up for me about telling the truths of our communities. I have called what I think is where we, in our place of invisibility, have been MIH, missing in history. And I came up with this thought that we were not just MIA, we're MIH, because I have always enjoyed going to museums, especially local museums that exist in small towns. And many of these places celebrate the master narrative of America, the Pilgrims, the cowboys, the whiteness of America, that does not acknowledge the genocide of indigenous people or the enslavement of people from Africa or the xenophobia towards people who are not white. And so I just wanted to, what came to mind were two places that I've been, and that is Sandwich, Massachusetts, and Virginia City, Nevada. And in both of those very small, towns and the small museums that exist in them, I found a couple of displays that had artifacts from China that were clearly created by Chinese people. And so Sandwich, Massachusetts is the oldest town in Cape Cod. It is the home of many sea captains, especially from the clipper ship days. And of course, they were going to China. And Virginia City was a mining town in the Rocky Mountains of the Old West. And so these towns today, or when I went to them, were largely white. I often felt like I was the only Asian person, to walk in their doors. And what was this stuff, Chinese stuff, doing there? How did they get there? Why were they there? There were no explanations. They were just there. And it occurred to me that if stuff from China came, it's likely that people from China came too. The things were valuable. The things were worth preserving. But what about the people? The people were expendable. They were detritus to be disposed of, including their stories. And so I thought they were lost to history, MIH, missing in history. And then there was my visit to the Alaska State Museum in Ketchikan, Alaska. I was there because I was doing research about the Filipino-American migrant workers in the Alaskan canneries, the fishing canneries. And there were different waves of Asian American immigrant workers that included Chinese, Korean, as well as Filipino American workers. And as I walked through that museum, I wondered, would I find any trace of those people who I knew had not only inhabited Alaska, but helped build it? And I found nothing until I saw a single photo on a wall. And that was about a machine that had been invented in 1903 that could clean and gut salmon, cut their heads off and tails off, and have them prepared for the canning industry. And on the wall of this picture of the machine was the caption, "Iron Chink." Iron chink, nothing else, no context, no explanation that this was a racial slur. It was so named by the inventor because the machine was so rapid it could do the work of 10 Chinese workers, and in a backhanded way might have been a compliment to the efficiency and productivity of these Chinese who were there. And I thought about all of the school children and the tourists off of cruise ships and people from all over the world who would visit this museum. And so I asked to speak to somebody in authority who I then, after waiting a while, got to meet, and who just looked at me as though I were somebody from Mars, and just got a kind of a polite, well, what's the big deal? So when I got home, I wrote a letter to explain what the big deal was and that this photo needed some context. It needed to explain at a minimum that this was a racial slur today. So I waited a month, and then 2 months, and then 6 months, and a year went by, and there was no response, and I forgot about it. And then more than a year later, I got a letter. It was from Alaska. It was from a curator at the museum who was so apologetic, said that they never would intentionally have a racial slur at their museum, and therefore they were removing the photo. So there was that unintended consequence. The photo, the only exhibit there that acknowledged the existence of Asian people in sort of a way, was removed. So now Asian Americans were MIH completely in Alaska's State Museum. Now that was 20 years ago, so maybe it's changed today. But I want to say that in many ways, archives are similar to museums, right? They are vaults of objects that document the lived lives of our communities. And choices have to be made. Whose lives are worth remembering? Whose lives are worth giving space for holdings, worth investing in classifying, digitizing, maintaining, storing, making them available? Archives require a lot of very skilled people and resources of every kind. And so whose archives and stories are worth keeping and devoted resources to? So I did want to say that the Harvard Radcliffe Schlesinger Archives will be the home for those Alaska letters and much more of mine. And I want to say this because I've spent a lot of time wondering where to put my stuff. And I've been often reminded by my wife, who has said more than a few times, if you get hit by a truck, what am I going to do with all of this bleep? And so I am sending my stacks of boxes to the Schlesinger Archives because they are committed to creating a space for Asian American women's stories as illustrated by this event and all the work that has gone behind creating Asian American women's collections. And the Schlesinger Archives are also going to get things from my mother. And there's not a lot because my mom was an abandoned girl. She was abandoned not once, but twice as a child in wartime China. And then she fled China because of the impending revolution. But my mother had an amazing memory. And for my last book, I spent hundreds of hours interviewing my mom. And after she passed away in 2017, just before I was completing the manuscript of my book that was inspired by her stories, I still found things that were a complete surprise and shock. So before I close, I thought I'd share a few of those things. And if we could have the photos, please. So this is this is my mom on the left with me as a baby. And on the right is my mom as she grew older and not long before she passed. And in the middle here is a little notebook, the kind of notebook you'll find at a supermarket or a drugstore or Kmart. And my mother had a bunch of these notebooks. Next slide, please. And so these are just a few of the notebooks. On the far left with 1993 and Helen, my mother, as the daughter of immigrants, a family of immigrants, you know, we kids were my parents' pension plan. We were their security. And so as soon as any of us made any money, no matter how small it was, we started sending money home. And lo and behold, my mother kept a little register of all of the money that for each of us. There are 6 kids, and there are sections in these notebooks. We had no idea. And after my mother passed away, my siblings and I sat around kind of looking at these books and going, oh, okay. And none of us, I have to say, including myself, who I have these books, are going to go through and add any of them up. But it's something my mother kept. And then there are these journals in Chinese. I had no idea my mother kept journals for years. I can't read them because they're in Chinese. And I'm a little afraid to get them translated because the book page that I have open has my name on it, you know, and various pages have different ones of us and different things in them, you know, that are pop up in English. And I'm afraid of what my mother might have said about me if I had done something bad or upset her in some way, but there they are. And so next slide, please. There are many of these little notebooks that show how my mother, who didn't get a formal education past the 3rd grade, had stacks and stacks of books where she practiced her English, where she went through vocabulary, and each word in English is written in her very careful handwriting that reminds me of so many handwritings of people whose first language is not English. It's so careful and deliberate and actually beautiful. And some are misspelled. And I've kind of leafed through them to see the kind of words that she thought were important to keep. Yeah, you can see them yourself. Some are very grateful: hospital, emergency, drugstores, hurt, crazy, poison. What do they mean? Why did she choose these words? You know, and the one on the right, I recognize some of these things. My mother, you know, she kept Hallmark cards in business. She would write cards and she would, in her careful handwriting, have the signatures with a message in there. And these are some of the messages she saved. Next word, please. Next slide, please. And so what did these mean? On the lined portion, you know, this must have been when my mother lived in New York or would be going to New York and would say, take the downtown local to Chinatown. That was something she wrote, and some subway words. But if you look at the page above, she's got gullet, soil, anus, urine, pass urine, semen, penis, vagina, womb. I mean, and then on the other side, happy Halloween. I don't know what these words mean. I don't know what my mother was thinking when she wrote them. What is the context? So if we could take the slideshow off, please. So I bring these forward because I want to say we all have things that we have found from dear ones, loved ones. And we have to ask, when it's too late, to ask them, what meaning can we draw from the things that our beloved communities leave behind? I don't know what my mother intended, but clearly these were significant enough for her to keep them. And so I'd like to end with the thought that if we safeguard the stories we tell and the objects we find, then future researchers, future generations can find the significance as well, and that our communities will not be invisible or MIH. So my thanks to all of you. Thank you to our panelists for their very thoughtful perspectives and for our audience for the terrific questions. My thanks to all at the Schlesinger Archives for all your efforts to make sure that Asian American women's voices will not go missing in history. As Dean Tomiko Brown-Niggen said, our history and archives must reflect we the people, so that our communities' stories will be preserved and shared and told for generations to come. And that concludes our program today. The program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. For information on upcoming Radcliffe virtual programs and to see the videos of past events, please visit www.radcliffe.harvard.edu. So thank you all again for joining us today, and please take care. Thank you.